The wrench slipped. Katherine Brennan's knuckles scraped against the undercarriage of the Ford F-250, drawing blood she didn't bother to wipe away. 58 years old, and her hands still remembered how to ignore pain. Some lessons the body never forgets, even when the mind begs to. The Nevada sun hammered down on the corrugated metal roof of her garage, turning the air inside to something you could chew. September heat in the high desert didn't care about calendars or clocks. It just pressed down like a hand on your chest until you learned to breathe shallow and move slow. She'd been under this truck for 2 hours. The transmission rebuild should have taken 1, but her mind kept wandering to places it had no business going. 18 years she'd been running this garage. 18 years of oil changes and brake jobs and the occasional engine swap for weekend warriors who thought their pickup trucks were race cars. Honest work. Quiet work. The kind of work that let you forget who you used to be. The radio on the workbench crackled to life. Some NPR affiliate out of Reno doing their afternoon news roundup. She didn't listen to it for the news. She listened because silence had a way of filling up with ghosts. In military affairs today, the Department of Defense announced the promotion list for the upcoming Brigadier General selections. Among those nominated is Colonel James Dutton, whose 40-year career has been marked by. Her hand froze on the wrench. The voice kept talking, something about exemplary service and dedication to duty, but the words turned to static in her ears. James Dutton. The name hit her chest like a rifle stock's recoil, familiar and brutal. She rolled out from under the truck and stood, bones protesting the concrete floor's cold kiss through her worn coveralls. Her hand reached for the radio, hovered there, pulled back, reached again. She turned it off. The silence rushed in like water filling a hole. Her reflection stared back from the chrome bumper, distorted and older than she felt inside. Gray streaked through hair she kept tied back in a ponytail that hadn't changed style since boot camp. Lines creased her face, each one a year of trying to forget. Her hands, still holding the wrench, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a mechanic. Not the hands of a master sergeant. Not the hands that had once held a rifle steady at distances most men couldn't see. The bell above the garage door chimed. She didn't turn around. Customers could wait or leave. Most days she didn't much care which. "Kid." The voice stopped her cold. She knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, even when you haven't heard it in 18 years. Deep and rough, worn down by cigarettes he'd promised to quit and probably never did. Victor Hayes. She still didn't turn around. "Shop's closed," she said. "Sign says open till 6. "Sign's wrong." She heard his boots on the concrete, the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned to walk carefully around landmines and broken women. He stopped 10 feet back, close enough to talk, far enough to run if she threw the wrench. "You look good, Kit." "You always were a liar, Vic." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. She could feel his eyes on her back, taking inventory. The gray hair. The stiff way she held her left shoulder where shrapnel had kissed her goodbye in '04. The weight she'd put on in places and lost in others. Time's math never balanced the way you wanted. "I need you to come back," he said. Now she turned, slowly, giving him time to see the look on her face and reconsider whatever fool's errand had brought him to her door. Victor Hayes was 62 and looked every day of it. The sergeant major insignia on his dress uniform meant he'd kept climbing after she'd been pushed off the ladder. His face had gone weathered and hard, desert-baked, until it looked like it might crack if he smiled. He wasn't smiling now. "Get out," she said. "Kit, please. I don't have anything to say to you. Haven't for 18 years. Math's not gonna change because you drove out here in your dress blues trying to look important." I'm not here about me. Then you're dumber than I remember. She turned back to the truck, picked up a shop rag, started wiping the grease from her hands with the kind of focus you use when you're trying not to think about putting a fist through someone's face. Behind her, Vic didn't move. The man had always been stubborn. It was one of the things she'd loved about him, back when love was still a word that meant something. Louis Chen is dying, Vic said. Her hand stopped moving. The rag fell to the floor. Cancer, Vic continued, his voice careful now, picking through a minefield. Stage 4. Doctors gave him 2, maybe 3 months. He's at the VA hospital in Barstow. She didn't speak. Couldn't. Louis Chen's name opened up a box in her chest she'd welded shut so long ago she'd forgotten it could still breathe. He wants to see you, Vic said. Before, he wants to make things right. Right, the word came out like a laugh but sounded more like choking. 18 years of wrong and now he wants to make it right. That's convenient. Cancer gives a man perspective, does it? Kid. Does it, Vic? Does knowing you're dying suddenly make you remember you've got a conscience? Or is it just that he doesn't want to meet his maker knowing he helped destroy someone's life to save his own ass? The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. She thought she'd buried that deeper. Vic reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, creased and worn like he'd been carrying it for days. He set it on the workbench between them. He asked me to give you this, said you'd understand after you read it. She stared at the envelope like it might bite. I'm not interested in his confessions. It's not a confession, Vic said. It's an invitation. To what? His funeral. I'll send flowers. To Twentynine Palms, to the range. That made her look up. Vic's face was stone, but his eyes had something in them she couldn't quite read. Something that looked almost like hope, which was the most dangerous thing a soldier could carry. Why the hell would I go back there? Because Chen says if you can still shoot the way you used to, it proves what Dutton did to you was a crime. And if you can't, he paused, choosing his words like ammunition. If you can't, then maybe you've suffered enough and he won't drag you into the fight. What fight? The one for your name, your honor, the truth about what happened in '06. The air in the garage got thick. She could feel her pulse in her temples, that old familiar rhythm that used to come right before the shot, right before everything went calm and clear, and the whole world narrowed down to wind and distance, and one perfect moment of absolute control. My honor, she said slowly, died in a compound outside Kandahar when I refused to murder children and got court-martialed for cowardice. My name died when they stripped my rank and put dishonorable discharge on paper. And the truth, she laughed, hard and sharp, the truth is buried under 18 years of not giving a damn anymore. Chen kept evidence. The words hit her like a slap. Vic's face was still stone, but his voice had an edge now. He kept the drone footage Dutton tried to erase. He kept recordings. He kept your logbook, the pages Dutton had torn out. All of it. 18 years, kid. He's been sitting on proof that you were right and Dutton was wrong, that you refused an illegal order and got crucified for having a conscience. She wanted to hit him, wanted to scream, wanted to ask why, if Chen had all that proof, had he let her burn for nearly 2 decades while she rebuilt her life one oil change at a time in a garage in the middle of nowhere. But she knew why. Chen had 3 kids back in '06. A wife, a mortgage, everything to lose. And when Dutton had threatened court-martial for everyone involved, when he'd promised to destroy anyone who spoke up, Chen had chosen his family over his friends. She couldn't even blame him for it. That was the worst part. Understanding why someone betrayed you didn't make it hurt less, but it made anger harder to hold. Why now? She asked. Because dying men stop being afraid, Vic said. And because he thinks maybe, just maybe, you can still do what no one else in the Corps can do. Which is break Dutton's record. She blinked. What? The long-range record at Twentynine Palms, 3,400 meters. Dutton said it in 2015 after he made colonel. Uses it as proof he's still got the touch, still the best sniper the Marines ever produced. Chen says if you break it publicly, it proves you never lost your skills. It proves the discharge was punitive, not performance-based. It proves Dutton lied. Katherine Brennan stood in her garage in the Nevada desert and felt the weight of 18 years pressing down like all that heat and silence had finally found its voice. She looked at the envelope on the workbench, at Vic standing there in his dress blues, older and harder but still the same man who'd lain beside her in a bunker and called wind speeds while she calculated the math of life and death. "I haven't fired a rifle in 18 years, she said. "I know. My shoulders got metal in it. My hands shake when I'm cold. I'm 58 years old, Vic." "I know. And you think I can make a shot that half the snipers in the Marine Corps can't make?" Vic's face finally cracked, just a little. Something that might have been a smile if smiles were made of sadness. "I think if anyone can, it's you. Thunder and lightning, kid. We were the best team that ever ran the ridge lines. Maybe we still are." Thunder and lightning. They're call signs from a war that felt like it belonged to different people. She'd been lightning, the striker. He'd been thunder, the warning. Together they'd been a storm the enemy never saw coming. She picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it should have been. Inside she could feel the shape of something small and hard, not just papers. "If I open this," she said, "and it's what you say it is, then you're asking me to go to war again. Not with bullets, but with the same bastards who have been running the show all along. You understand that?" "Yes." "And you're willing to stand with me this time. Not behind me, not watching from a distance, but beside me, even if it costs you everything you've built." Vic met her eyes. For the first time since he'd walked in, she saw past the uniform and the rank and all the years between them. She saw the man who'd saved her life in '04, the man who'd stayed silent in '06, the man who'd lived with that silence every day since. "I should have stood with you then," he said quietly. "I was afraid of losing my career, my pension, everything I'd worked for, so I let you fall alone. That's the truth, kid. I was a coward." "Yes, you were." "I can't change the past, but Chen's giving us a chance to change what comes next. Maybe that's not redemption. Maybe it's just less guilt to carry into whatever's waiting on the other side." She turned the envelope over in her hands. Through the thin paper, she could feel edges and corners of something that felt like metal. "What's the catch?" she asked. "Chen's not asking me to break a record out of the goodness of his dying heart. What does he want in return?" "He wants to know you're still you," Vic said. "He wants to know that what Dutton did to you didn't break the part that matters, the part that stands up when everyone else sits down, the part that says no when the world screams yes. If you can still shoot like you used to, it means you're still that woman. And if you're still that woman, then maybe his testimony means something. Maybe his evidence can actually win in a court-martial. And if I can't shoot anymore?" "Then he lets it die with him. He doesn't drag you back into a fight you can't win. He said, and I quote, 'If Kit's lost her edge, then she's already paid enough. I won't make her pay twice.'" Katherine looked down at the envelope in her hands, at the grease under her fingernails, at the concrete floor stained with oil and history, at the life she'd built from the wreckage of the one that had been taken from her. She could say no. She could hand the envelope back, watch Vic drive away and go back to her transmission rebuild. In 3 months, Louis Chen would die with his secrets. In a few years, James Dutton would pin on his first star and retire with full honors. And she would stay here in this garage, fixing other people's broken things while her own stayed buried. Or she could open the envelope. She tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded. Two people in desert fatigues standing beside a Humvee, helmets off, dust on their faces, smiles small but real. She recognized herself immediately, younger and harder, eyes that hadn't yet learned what betrayal looked like. Beside her, Louis Chen, thinner than, laughing at something off camera. On the back, in Chen's handwriting, Kit and Louis Fob Sharana 2005. Before everything. Beneath the photo was a folded piece of paper. She opened it with shaking hands. Kit, if you're reading this, it means Vic found you. It means you haven't completely disappeared, which gives me more hope than I probably deserve. I'm dying. The doctors use bigger words, but that's what it comes down to. 3 months if I'm lucky, less if I'm not. I've spent 18 years trying to forget what happened in '06, trying to convince myself that staying silent was the right choice, that protecting my family mattered more than protecting the truth. Maybe it did. Maybe I'm just a coward looking for redemption I don't deserve. But here's what I know, you were right. That compound had civilians. You saw children through your scope and you refused the shot. Dutton ordered you to fire anyway to create plausible deniability for a NATO airstrike that went wrong. You said no. I stayed silent. Vic stayed silent, and they destroyed you for having a conscience. I have evidence. Drone footage, audio recordings, your logbook pages. All of it hidden for 18 years because I was too afraid to use it, but I'm not afraid anymore. Dead men have that luxury. I'll testify. I'll give everything to Jag. I'll burn what's left of my name to clear yours. But I need to know something first. I need to know that you're still the woman I served with. The woman who could make impossible shots and impossible choices. The woman who stood up when the rest of us sat down. Dutton set the long-range record at Twentynine Palms. 3,400 meters. He uses it to prove he's still the best, still untouchable. Break it, Kit. Come back to the range, pick up a rifle, and show them you never lost what made you dangerous. Not your marksmanship, your integrity. If you can still shoot like you used to, it proves they were wrong about you. It proves the discharge was retaliation, not performance. It proves everything. And if you can't, if the years have taken too much, then I understand. I won't drag you into a fight you can't win. I'll die knowing I tried and you can go back to whatever peace you found. But I'm hoping, I'm praying that somewhere under all that scar tissue, lightning is still there, still ready to strike. Because Thunder and I were ready to make some noise. One last time. Your last spotter, Louis Chen. She read it twice, then a third time. The paper trembled in her hands, and she realized she was crying without sound, the way soldiers cry when they've forgotten how to let anyone see. Vic stood silent, giving her the space grief demanded. Outside, the sun was starting its slow fall toward the Sierra Nevadas, painting the sky in colors that had no names. Inside the garage, 18 years of carefully constructed distance collapsed like a building with its supports cut. When? She asked, her voice rough. Chen wants you there in 3 days. There's a demonstration scheduled, a bunch of brass coming through to watch the new recruits. He figured that'd be the best time to make it public. Public? If you're going to break the record, might as well have witnesses. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing grease and salt water across her cheek. She probably looked like hell. She didn't care. I'll need access to the range before then. Need to see if I can still hit anything beyond 100 meters. Already arranged. You're listed as a civilian ballistic consultant. Cover story is you're testing some new targeting software. You've thought of everything. I've had 18 years to plan what I'd say if I ever found the courage to come here. She looked at him then, really looked. Saw the weight he'd been carrying, different from hers but just as heavy. saw the uniform that represented everything he'd chosen over friendship, saw the man underneath who'd lived with that choice every single day. "I haven't forgiven you," she said. "I know. And I might not ever. I know that too. But if we're doing this, we're doing it right. No more silence. No more choosing the easy path because the hard one costs too much. We go after Dutton with everything we have, and we don't stop until either he's in chains or we are. Understood?" Vic straightened, and for a moment she saw the spotter he'd been, the man who'd watched her back through 1,000 shots and never flinched. "Thunder and lightning," he said. "One last storm," she answered. She looked down at the photograph again, at the two people who'd been young enough to think war had rules and justice had a price tag they could afford. She thought about Louis Chen lying in a hospital bed, counting down the days. She thought about James Dutton preparing to pin on a star he'd earned by burying truth under 18 years of lies. And she thought about a rifle she hadn't touched in nearly 2 decades, waiting somewhere in the dark corners of Twentynine Palms, ready to speak the only language that had ever made sense to her. The language of absolute precision. The language of impossible shots and unshakable resolve. The language of a woman who'd said no when the world demanded yes, and paid for it with everything she'd been. Katherine Brennan looked at Victor Hayes and saw the ghost of the team they'd been, the storm that had rolled through the mountains of Afghanistan with thunder and lightning, and the cold mathematics of mercy. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She walked to the back of the garage, to a metal cabinet she hadn't opened in 18 years. The lock was rusted, but the key still hung on a chain around her neck, hidden under her shirt where no one could see. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and memory, was her logbook. The real one, not the sanitized version Dutton had tried to create. Every shot, every mission, every calculation written in her own hand. The last pages torn out, supposedly destroyed. But Chen had kept them. Chen had kept everything. She pulled the book out and held it like a grenade, something that could explode and take down everyone in the blast radius, herself included. "If I do this," she said, not looking at Vic, "if I go back and break that record and we bring Dutton down, what happens next? You thought about that. You thought about what it means for you, for Chen's family, for everyone who stayed silent." "I've thought about nothing else for 18 years. And I'm tired of being afraid," Vic said. "I'm tired of looking in the mirror and seeing a coward. If this costs me everything, at least I'll die knowing I finally did one brave thing, even if it's 18 years too late." She turned to face him, the logbook in her hands, Chen's letter in her pocket, and 18 years of rage and grief and stubborn survival burning in her chest like a furnace that had never quite gone cold. "Then I guess we're going to war," she said. Vic nodded once, sharp and sure. "I'll pick you up in 2 days, 0600. Bring work clothes, nothing military, we're going in quiet." "Quiet's never been my style, Vic." "No," he said, and this time he did smile, sad and fierce and real. "But loud always was." He turned and walked out of the garage, his boots echoing on the concrete until the sound faded into the desert heat. She stood alone in the silence that rushed back in, holding the pieces of a life she thought she'd left behind. The truck's transmission could wait. The wrench could wait. Everything could wait. Because somewhere in the California desert, on a range where she'd once been the best in the world, a target was waiting at 3,400 meters. And beyond it, a man who'd built his career on her destruction was waiting to learn what happened when lightning finally remembered how to strike. She looked down at the photograph one more time, at Louis Chen's smile, at her own younger face, still innocent enough to believe that doing the right thing would be enough. It hadn't been enough then. But maybe, just maybe, with 3 days and a rifle and the ghost of thunder beside her, it could be enough now. She slipped the photograph into her pocket next to Chen's letter, locked the cabinet, and walked out of the garage into the fading light. Above her, the sky was turning from blue to purple to that deep desert black that holds more stars than the human mind can count. Somewhere up there, in the mathematics of wind and gravity and the arc of bullets through time, an equation was waiting to be solved. Katherine Brennan had always been good at math. It was time to show them she hadn't forgotten how to count. The drive from Nevada to California took 6 hours through landscape that looked like God had gotten bored halfway through creation and just walked away. Katherine Brennan sat in the passenger seat of Vic's truck, watching the desert blur past in shades of brown and amber, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. She wasn't. Prayer required faith in something bigger than yourself, and she'd lost that particular religion somewhere between the rifle scope and the court-martial. Vic drove in silence, which was good because she had nothing to say. The logbook sat in her duffel bag in the bed of the truck, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had kept it safe for 18 years. Chen's letter was in her shirt pocket, folded and refolded so many times the creases had started to wear through. She could feel it against her ribs with every breath, a reminder that some debts don't care how long you run. They hit the California border just after noon. The sun was a white disk in a sky too pale to call blue, and the heat radiating off the asphalt made the air shimmer like something alive. Vic turned off the highway onto a 2-lane road that cut through hills the color of old bones, and Katherine felt something in her chest start to tighten. She knew this road, knew every curve and rise. 23 years ago she'd driven it for the first time, fresh out of sniper school, thinking she was headed toward glory. 18 years ago she'd driven it in the opposite direction, discharged and broken, thinking she was headed toward nothing. Now she was back, and she still didn't know which direction she was going. "You okay?" Vic asked, first words he'd spoken since they left Nevada. "No." "Fair enough." They drove another 10 miles before the base appeared in the distance, a cluster of tan buildings and green equipment against the endless brown. Twentynine Palms, Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center. 50 goddamn square miles of desert dedicated to teaching young men and women how to kill efficiently and die honorably. She'd loved it once, the way you love anything that gives your life structure and purpose. Now it just looked like a monument to choices she couldn't take back. Vic showed his ID at the gate. The young Marine on duty barely glanced at Katherine, just waved them through with the bored efficiency of someone who'd checked 1,000 IDs that morning and would check 1,000 more before shift change. She wondered if he knew what history looked like, if he could see the ghost of the master sergeant she'd been sitting in his passenger seat, invisible in civilian clothes and time's erosion. Probably not. The young never see the old as anything but old. They parked outside the bachelor enlisted quarters, a long building that had probably looked depressing when it was new and hadn't improved with age. Vic killed the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. "They've got you set up in the civilian contractor quarters," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's private. Chen's at the VA hospital in Barstow, about an hour east. He wants to see you before the demonstration." "When's the demonstration?" "Day after tomorrow, 0900. They're bringing in a bunch of brass, some congressmen, couple of defense contractors. Big show for the new training program. You'll be listed as part of the ballistic software demo. And the record attempt. End of the day, after the official program wraps. Dutton won't be there for the morning show. He's flying in that evening for a dinner thing. We'll make the attempt while he's at dinner, then hit him with it when he walks into the officers' club. Katherine nodded slowly. The tactics made sense. Dutton wouldn't see it coming, wouldn't have time to interfere or shut it down. By the time he knew what was happening, the record would be broken and witnessed by enough people that he couldn't just bury it. If she could still shoot. If 18 years hadn't taken too much. If her hands stayed steady and her eyes stayed clear, and all the muscle memory her body had spent 2 decades trying to forget decided to come back for one last dance. "I need range time," she said. "Today, before I see Chen, I need to know if I can still do this." Vic looked at her, and something passed across his face that might have been worry or might have been understanding. Probably both. "Range is yours all afternoon. I've got an M110 checked out, match-grade ammo, the works. Nobody else will be there. Just you and the targets and whatever ghosts you need to make peace with." She grabbed her duffel from the truck bed and followed Vic inside to drop it off. The contractor quarters were spare but clean. A single bed with military corners, a desk that had seen better decades, a window overlooking more desert. She'd slept in worse places, died a little in better ones. 20 minutes later they were at range 400, a long-distance course that stretched out into the desert like a runway to nowhere. The sun was past its peak now, starting that slow afternoon fall that turned the light from white to gold. Wind flags hung limp in the heat, barely moving. Good conditions for a test run. Not that it mattered. She'd made shots in sandstorms and snowfall, in winds that could knock a man down and rain that turned dirt to soup. Weather was just another variable in the equation, and she'd always been good at math. The M110 sat on a bench, black and predatory, a weapon that looked exactly like what it was, a tool for reaching out across impossible distances and changing the outcome of battles with one perfect moment of violence. She approached it the way you approach an old lover, careful and cautious, knowing that some things can hurt you twice. Vic set up a spotting scope and a range card, all business now, falling into the rhythm they'd perfected over hundreds of missions. He'd always been methodical, the kind of spotter who triple-checked everything and never let excitement or fear cloud his calculations. It was what had made them good together. Thunder and lightning. The warning and the strike. "Targets at 500, 800, and 1,000 meters, Vic said. "Winds light, 3 to 5 knots from the southwest. Temperature 94 degrees, barometric pressure steady. Good conditions for a warm-up." Katherine picked up the rifle. The weight was familiar and foreign all at once, like picking up a language you used to speak fluent and finding half the words gone. She ran her hands over the stock, checked the action, felt the triggers pull. Everything was exactly as it should be. The rifle didn't care that she was 58 or that her shoulder had metal in it or that her hands sometimes shook when she was cold. The rifle just waited, patient and ready, for someone who knew what they were doing. She settled into position, cheek against the stock, eye to the scope. The world narrowed down to crosshairs and distance and the small adjustments that meant the difference between hitting and missing. Her breathing slowed automatically, falling into the old pattern. Inhale, exhale, pause. Inhale, exhale, pause. The space between heartbeats where everything went still. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked and bucked against her shoulder, familiar as a handshake. 500 meters downrange, dust kicked up 2 feet left of the target. "Miss," Vic called, his voice neutral. "Impact low left, 0.6 meters." She worked the bolt, chambered another round. Adjusted for the pull she'd felt in the trigger, the way her shoulder had flinched. Muscle memory was there, buried under 18 years of not using it, trying to surface through all that scar tissue and time. Second shot, closer, still a miss but only by inches now. Low right, 0.2 meters. Third shot. The target rang like a bell. the sound carrying across the desert in a tone that spoke of metal finding metal. Hit center mass. Something loosened in her chest. Not relief, not yet. Just the first small acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, the woman she'd been was still in there somewhere, waiting. She spent the next hour walking her shots out. 500 meters became routine. 800 meters came back slower, requiring adjustments she'd once made without thinking but now had to calculate consciously. 1,000 meters was harder still, the wind becoming a factor, the heat waves making the target dance and blur. But she hit it. Not every time, not with the effortless precision she'd once commanded, but enough. Enough to remember what it felt like when everything aligned and the bullet went exactly where she'd sent it. Vic spotted in silence, calling corrections in the clipped professional tone that meant he was working, not socializing. They'd spent years together in that space, the spotter and the shooter, two parts of one weapon system. Now they were finding it again, tentative and careful, like dancers learning old steps. The sun was getting low when she finally set the rifle down. Her shoulder ached, her hands were cramping, and she could feel the beginning of a headache building behind her eyes. Age wasn't kind to snipers. The eyes went first usually, then the steadiness, then the patience. She still had the patience. The rest was a question she wouldn't know the answer to until she stood at that firing line and aimed at a target 3,400 meters away. "You looked good out there," Vic said. "Rusty, but good. Another day of practice and you'll be grouping tight." 3,400 meters isn't grouping tight. It's threading a needle in a windstorm while standing on a moving train. You've made harder shots. I was younger. You were also angrier. Anger's good fuel. She looked at him then, really looked. He'd taken off his cover, and the sun caught the gray in his hair, turned it silver against the desert's gold. His hands as he packed up the spotting scope were steady and sure, the hands of a man who'd spent 40 years doing this work and still believed it mattered. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Real answer, Vic. Not the guilt, not the redemption. What do you get out of watching me try to destroy the career of a man who's about to make general? He finished packing the scope before he answered, taking his time, choosing his words the way a sniper chooses his shot. "Because I'm tired," he said finally. "Tired of watching men like Dutton get promoted while people like you get buried. Tired of knowing that the system protects the institution over the individual every goddamn time. Tired of being part of that system and not doing a damn thing to change it." He looked at her and his eyes were hard. "I've got 6 months till retirement. After that, none of this matters. My pension, my rank, whatever legacy I thought I was building. None of it matters if I die knowing I stood by and watched them destroy the best soldier I ever served with." "I'm not the best soldier you ever served with." "Yeah," he said, "you are. Because when it mattered, when they ordered you to do something that would let you sleep easy and keep your career intact, you said no. You chose the hard right over the easy wrong. How many of us can say that?" The question hung in the desert air between them. She didn't have an answer, and he didn't seem to expect one. They drove back to the base in silence, the sky turning from gold to purple to that deep blue that comes right before true dark. Katherine watched the landscape fade into shadows and thought about Louis Chen dying in a hospital bed an hour east, counting down days. Thought about James Dutton preparing to pin on a star built on lies. Thought about a shot she hadn't taken 18 years ago, and all the ways that choice had defined everything that came after. That night she lay in the single bed with its military corners and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the base settling down around her. Diesel engines and distant voices, and the occasional bark of a drill sergeant who'd found some poor bastard out of uniform. She'd lived with these sounds for years, let them become the soundtrack to a life that made sense. Now they just sounded like echoes from a place she'd stopped belonging to. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams she'd spent 18 years trying to forget. Afghanistan, summer of 2006. The heat different from California heat, wetter somehow, clinging to your skin like oil. She and Vic in a hide position, overlooking a compound that intelligence said was a Taliban safe house. Dutton on the radio, telling them to engage the target, that the compound had been confirmed hostile. But she'd looked through her scope and seen children. Two of them, maybe 8 and 10 years old, playing in a courtyard with a ball made of rags and tape. And she'd seen the women, 4 of them, hanging laundry on a line. And she'd known, with the certainty that comes from 3 years of looking at targets through magnified lenses, that intelligence had it wrong. She'd told Dutton, civilian compound, multiple non-combatants, requesting target verification. His voice had come back hard and cold. Target is verified. Engage or I'll find someone who will. She'd refused. Vic beside her, tense and silent, not backing her up but not contradicting her either. Just frozen, caught between the order and the truth. And then the airstrike had come. Not from her rifle, but from an F-18 that screamed overhead and dropped ordnance that turned the compound into dust and screaming. 14 dead, 6 of them children, 8 women, 0 combatants. Intelligence had been wrong. Dutton had known it was wrong. And he tried to get Katherine to fire first so there'd be a sniper engagement on record, something to justify the strike as a response to hostile fire. She'd said no, and for saying no, for having a conscience, they'd stripped her rank and thrown her out. She woke up with her heart pounding and her hands shaking, the dream fading but the anger staying sharp and fresh as the day had happened. The clock on the nightstand read 0300 in harsh red numbers. 3 in the morning, the hour when everything hurts worse and hope seems like a lie people tell themselves. She got up, pulled on her clothes, walked outside into the desert night. The sky was enormous here, unpolluted by city lights, so thick with stars it looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. She'd forgotten how beautiful it could be, this place. How the desert at night felt like the surface of another planet, vast and indifferent and clean. She walked to range 400, her boots crunching on gravel, her breath visible in the sudden cold that came when the sun stopped baking everything. The range was locked, but she didn't need to go in. She just stood at the fence and looked out at the darkness where targets waited, invisible now but still there, still patient. 3,400 meters, 2.1 miles, a distance that most people couldn't accurately throw a rock, let alone send a bullet. Wind would be a factor, temperature, humidity, the rotation of the Earth itself, the Coriolis effect that pulled rounds right in the northern hemisphere. 1,000 variables, any one of which could turn a perfect shot into a miss. And even if she made it, even if she threaded that impossible needle and broke Dutton's record, what then? Chen would testify. The evidence would come out. Dutton would face a court-martial. But justice in the military didn't work like justice in the civilian world. Officers protected officers. The institution protected itself. There was a very real chance that all of this, all the risk and pain and dragging up the past, would end with Dutton getting a slap on the wrist and Chen dying knowing his testimony hadn't mattered. She could walk away. Right now, this moment, she could get in Vic's truck and drive back to Nevada and let the whole thing die with Louis Chen in 3 months. Nobody would blame her. Hell, most people would call it the smart play. But she'd never been good at smart plays. She'd always been better at the hard, right over the easy wrong. A sound behind her made her turn. Vic stood there in PT gear, looking like he'd been out running. Probably had. The man was 62 and still did 5 miles before breakfast. Couldn't sleep either, he asked. Dreams. Yeah, He came and stood beside her at the fence, looking out at the same darkness. I get those too, the compound, the children, the way Dutton's voice sounded when he gave the order. You never told me that. Never told anyone. Seemed like the kind of thing that just make it worse, spreading it around. But it's there. Every night. Has been for 18 years. They stood in silence for a while. Two old soldiers looking at ghosts only they could see. Chen wants to see you tomorrow, Vic said finally. Before the demonstration. I told him I'd bring you by around 0700. How is he? Dying, but stubborn about it. Wants to make sure everything's set before he goes. He always was thorough. Best RTO I ever worked with. Could call in fire support in a sandstorm and have it land exactly where you needed it. Never panicked, never froze. Vic paused. Not like me. You didn't freeze in 06. Didn't I? When you needed me to back you up to tell Dutton you were right, I stayed silent. If that's not freezing, I don't know what is. Katherine thought about that. About all the ways courage could fail you, all the moments when fear won out over honor. 18 years she'd hated Vic and Chen for staying silent. 18 years she'd carried that betrayal like a stone in her chest. But standing here in the desert dark, listening to the man who'd saved her life admit that failing her had haunted him every day since, she felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet. Maybe not ever, but something adjacent to it. Understanding, perhaps. The recognition that everyone breaks eventually and the lucky ones get a chance to put themselves back together. Tomorrow, she said, after we see Chen, I want to run the full distance. 3,400 meters, real conditions, everything. You sure? That's a hell of a session before the actual attempt. I need to know if I can do it. Need to know before I see him. If I can't make the shot, I'm not dragging him into a fight based on a lie. Vic nodded slowly. Okay, but Kit, you should know something. Dutton's coming in early. Word is he heard something's up, some civilian consultant making noise about the long-range program. He's moved up his schedule. He'll be here tomorrow night. Good. Good. Yeah, I want him to watch. Want him to see exactly what he threw away when he destroyed my career. Want him to understand that all his records and ribbons and stars don't mean shit compared to one person with the courage to say no. Vic smiled in the darkness, fierce and proud. There's the lightning I remember. Lightning's older now, slower, not sure she's got the same spark. Guess we'll find out tomorrow. They walked back toward the buildings together, two ghosts moving through the pre-dawn dark, and Katherine felt the weight of 18 years pressing down like all that sky and distance finally demanding an accounting. Tomorrow she'd see Louis Chen, the man who'd kept her secrets and her logbook and his silence for nearly 2 decades. Tomorrow she'd stand on a firing line and aim at a target most trained snipers couldn't hit on their best day. Tomorrow she'd find out if the woman who'd said no to James Dutton in 2006 was still alive somewhere under all this scar tissue and time. And if she was, if that woman could still make impossible shots and impossible choices, then maybe Chen's testimony would matter. Maybe the evidence would stick. Maybe, just possibly, 18 years of wrong could start to bend back toward right. It wasn't justice. Not really. Justice would have been stopping it before it started, before 14 civilians died and her career burned and all the years got lost to anger and exile. But it was something, a reckoning, a settling of accounts. And for Katherine Brennan, standing in the California desert as the sky started to lighten in the east, that was enough to keep walking toward whatever came next. Even if what came next was a rifle and a target, and the longest shot of her life. Even if it all ended in failure and disappointment, and the confirmation that some things, once broken, stay broken. She'd face Louis Chen tomorrow with her head up and her hands steady, and she'd tell him the truth. She was still the woman who'd refused an illegal order. She was still the soldier who'd chosen conscience over career. And if that meant one last fight against a system designed to crush people like her, then so be it. Thunder and lightning. One last storm before the long quiet. She just hoped the desert was ready for what was coming. The VA hospital in Barstow smelled like every VA hospital Katherine had ever walked into. Disinfectant trying to cover up the smell of slow death, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous song, and underneath it all, the particular sadness of warriors ending their campaigns in rooms that looked nothing like battlefields. She'd visited enough dying soldiers to know that hospitals were where heroes came to learn they were mortal after all. Vic led her through corridors painted in colors designed by someone who'd never met a veteran, past rooms where old men lay connected to machines that beeped out the rhythm of hearts that had seen too much. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the walls wouldn't swallow anyway. Louis Chen's room was at the end of the hall, door half open, morning light spilling through a window that looked out onto a parking lot, and beyond it, more desert. Always more desert. Katherine stopped outside, her hand on the doorframe, and for a moment she couldn't make herself go in. 18 years of anger and betrayal and bitter survival stood between her and that door like a wall she'd built brick by brick. Vic put his hand on her shoulder, gentle. "He's waiting." She stepped inside. The man in the bed looked nothing like the Louis Chen she remembered. That Chen had been solid and quick, all nervous energy and constant motion, the kind of radio operator who could work 3 frequencies at once and never miss a call. This Chen was skeletal, his skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, his eyes sunken but still sharp, still alive with whatever fire kept men breathing when everything else said it was time to quit. He smiled when he saw her. The smile was real, which somehow made it worse. "Kit," he said, his voice a whisper of what it had been, "you came." She crossed the room and stood by the bed, looking down at the ghost of her friend. Up close she could see the IV lines, the oxygen cannula, the hospital gown that hung on him like a tent. Could see the cost of 3 months to live being optimistic. "You asked," she said. "I came, that's how it works." "Not always, not for me. I asked you to forgive me 18 years ago. You didn't come then. You didn't ask. You stayed silent and let me burn." "I know," he shifted in the bed, wincing. "I've practiced this conversation 10,000 times. All the things I'd say, all the explanations. Turns out most of them were just excuses dressed up pretty." He met her eyes. "I was afraid, Kit, afraid of losing everything. Dutton said if anyone spoke up, he'd court-martial all of us. And I had Jenny and the kids, and I thought keeping quiet was choosing them over you." "It was." "Yeah, it was. And I've lived with that choice every single day since. Lived with knowing I let you take the fall for doing the right thing while I hid behind my family like they were a shield." He coughed, a wet sound that spoke of fluid and failure. "But here's the thing about dying. It clarifies your thinking. Makes you realize that all the things you were afraid of losing, you lose anyway. Just slower, more painful." Katherine pulled up a chair and sat. Her hands were shaking and she didn't try to hide it. "Why now, Louis? Why wait until you're 3 months from the grave to suddenly grow a conscience?" "Because I'm a coward who needed a deadline." He said it simply, without self-pity. "Because knowing I'm dying freed me from being afraid of what they could take. They can't take anything from a dead man, Kit. Can't threaten my pension or my reputation or my family's benefits. I'm already gone. All that's left is what I leave behind." "And what's that?" "The truth. And maybe, if I'm lucky, a chance to help you get back what they stole." He reached for something on the bedside table, his hand trembling with effort. Vic moved to help, but Chen waved him off, stubborn even now. He picked up a tablet, swiped through screens with fingers that looked too thin to have any strength left. "I kept everything," he said. "Every piece of evidence from that day. The drone footage showing the compound before the strike, clear as day, women and children everywhere, not a weapon in sight. The audio recordings of Dutton ordering you to engage after you'd already reported civilians. Your logbook pages, the ones they tore out and said were destroyed." He turned the tablet toward her. "It's all here. 18 years of proof that you were right and they were wrong." Katherine looked at the screen, at footage she'd never seen, showing the compound from above, at women hanging laundry, at children playing, at a scene so obviously civilian that any competent analyst should have called off the strike. Should have, but didn't, because someone had needed those people dead and needed it to look justified. "Why did Dutton do it?" she asked. "What was worth 14 innocent lives?" Chen's face went hard. Because the real target was 3 compounds over, high-value Taliban commander, and Ney dropped ordnance on the wrong building, killed a bunch of civilians, made international news, became a diplomatic nightmare. Dutton needed a cover story, needed to say there'd been hostile fire from the compound, that they'd had to respond. If you'd taken the shot he ordered, if there was a sniper engagement on record, the narrative works. Sniper confirms hostiles, airstrike follows, tragic mistake but defensible. "But I didn't take the shot." "No, you reported civilians and refused the order, which meant there was no justification, which meant Dutton had to bury you to bury the truth. So he court-martialed you for cowardice, said you'd frozen under fire, used his rank and connections to push it through before anyone could look too close." Chen's eyes were wet now. "And Vic and I sat in that hearing and said nothing. We had the power to stop it and we chose not to. We chose wrong." Vic stood by the window, his back to them, shoulders tight. Katherine could see the tension in every line of his body, the way shame made men smaller even when they were standing at attention. "I need to know something," Katherine said. "Why the shot? Why make me prove I can still shoot before you'll testify? Why make me break Dutton's record?" Chen smiled, sad and knowing. "Because if I bring this evidence to JAG, Dutton's lawyers will say you're bitter, washed up, that your whole story is sour grapes from someone who couldn't cut it. But if you break his record, if you prove you're still the best damn sniper anyone's ever seen, then it's not bitterness. It's competence. It's proof that the discharge was punitive, not performance-based. It changes the narrative from failed soldier seeking revenge to wronged warrior demanding justice. That's tactics. That's survival. Courts-martial aren't about truth, Kit. They're about convincing 12 officers that the system worked right. Give them a reason to believe you were wronged and they might actually care. Show up bitter and broken and they'll confirm the discharge just to avoid admitting they made a mistake." He leaned forward, urgent now despite the pain it clearly caused. "Break that record. Show them you never lost what made you dangerous. Make Dutton watch you do what he can't anymore. Then I bring the evidence. Vic testifies, and we bury him the way he buried you." Katherine sat back in the chair, processing. The mathematics of justice, calculated with the same precision she'd once used to calculate windage and bullet drop. Louis Chen, dying and desperate, had spent his last months building a case that might actually work. "There's a problem," she said. "Dutton's coming in early. He'll be at the base tonight before the demonstration. If he hears what I'm planning, he'll shut it down. Then don't let him hear. Make the attempt during the demonstration, in front of all the brass and congressmen. Make it so public he can't stop it without looking like he's got something to hide. The demonstration's tomorrow morning. I was supposed to attempt the record tomorrow evening. Change the timeline. Talk to whoever's running the show, get yourself added to the program. You're already listed as a civilian consultant, right? Consultant needs to demonstrate the ballistic software at range. 3,400 meters is a hell of a demonstration." Katherine looked at Vic, Can we do that? Vic turned from the window, his face thoughtful. Colonel Martinez is running the demonstration. She's old school, doesn't like Dutton much. If I explain the situation, leave out the court-martial stuff, and just say we want to showcase the new software at extended range, she might go for it. She'll want to know why it has to be tomorrow. Tell her the software's only calibrated for current atmospheric conditions. Tell her the contractor's only available this week. Tell her whatever we need to tell her to make it happen. Vic's voice was steady now, determined. We've spent 18 years playing by rules that were rigged against us. Maybe it's time we bent a few. Chen coughed again, harder this time, his whole body shaking with it. Katherine grabbed a cup of water from the bedside table, held it while he sipped. His hand on hers was cold, the skin papery and thin. "Thank you," he whispered when he could breathe again, "for coming, for giving me a chance to do one right thing before I go." "Don't thank me yet, I haven't made the shot." "You will. I've seen you thread needles I didn't think were possible. This is just one more. This one matters more." They all mattered, Kit. Every shot you ever took mattered to someone. That's what Dutton never understood. For him, it was always about the record, the recognition, the proof that he was the best. For you, it was always about the mission, about bringing people home. He squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. "That's why you'll make this shot," and he never could, because you're not doing it for glory, you're doing it for truth. She sat with him for another hour, not talking much, just being present while the machines beeped and the sun tracked across the parking lot outside. They talked about old times, about missions that had gone right and ones that had gone sideways, about the strange family that forms when people trust each other with their lives. They didn't talk about Jenny or the kids or the 3 months Louis might not actually have. Some things were too heavy for dying men to carry. When she finally stood to leave, Chen grabbed her wrist one last time. "Kit, when you make that shot, when you're looking through the scope and doing all the math and the wind's doing whatever the wind does, remember something for me." "What?" "You've already won. The moment you pick up that rifle and stand on that line, you've won. Because you're still here, still fighting, still refusing to let them break you. The shot's just confirmation." She nodded, not trusting her voice, walked to the door, stopped. "Louis." "Yeah. I forgive you." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and fierce. Chen's eyes closed, and she saw his lips move in what might have been a prayer or just a thank you too quiet to hear. She walked out into the hallway where Vic was waiting, and they left the hospital without speaking, drove back toward Twentynine Palms through desert that looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but somehow felt different. Like the world had shifted slightly on its axis, and nothing would line up quite the same way again. "You meant it?" Vic asked after 20 miles. "The forgiveness?" "I don't know, maybe. Probably not all the way. But he's dying and I'm tired of carrying hate. Seemed like a good time to set it down." "What about me?" She looked at him, at the profile she knew as well as her own, weathered and hard and marked by years of choices both right and wrong. "You're not dying." "No." "Then you get to carry it a while longer. Earn it before I give it." He nodded slowly. "Fair." They spent the afternoon at range 400, and this time Katherine didn't hold back. She ran the full progression, from 500 meters out to the maximum distance the range allowed. At 2,000 meters, she was grouping within 8 inches. At 2,500, she was still hitting steel. At 3,000 meters, the absolute limit of what most snipers considered possible, she put 3 rounds in a circle you could cover with a dinner plate. Vic spotted like a man possessed, calling wind and conditions with the precision of someone who knew this might be the last chance he ever got to do the job he'd trained his whole life for. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. The work spoke for itself, the old rhythm returning like muscle memory that had been sleeping but never quite died. By the time the sun started its fall toward the western hills, Catherine's shoulder was screaming and her hands were cramping, and she'd burned through 200 rounds of match-grade ammunition. But she was ready as 58 years and 18 years of rust would let her be. "Tomorrow," Vic said as they packed up, 0900 demonstration starts. I talked to Colonel Martinez. She's putting you in the program at 10:30, right after the small arms demo. You'll have 30 minutes to set up and make the attempt." "Will Dutton be there?" "He's scheduled to arrive at 0800. He'll be in the VIP section with the congressmen and contractors. Front row seat." "Good. Kit, you know what happens if you miss, right? If you don't break the record, Chen's testimony becomes a lot less convincing. The whole case gets weaker." "I know. And you know Dutton will have lawyers, connections, the entire weight of the system behind him. Even with the evidence, even with Chen's testimony, there's a good chance he walks away with nothing more than a reprimand." "I know that too. So why do it? Why risk everything on a shot you might not make against a man who might not pay?" She looked out at the desert, at the targets standing in the distance like sentinels marking off the miles. "Because Louis is dying and needs to know his last act mattered. Because you need to know standing up late is better than never standing at all. Because somewhere there's another young soldier being told to do something wrong, and maybe if they see that fighting back is possible, they'll have the courage I barely had." She turned to face him. "And because James Dutton needs to learn that some people can't be broken, no matter how hard you try." They drove back to base as the sky turned from blue to purple to black. Catherine lay in the single bed with its military corners and didn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and running through calculations in her head. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, the Coriolis effect, the Magnus effect, every variable that would matter when the bullet left the barrel and began its 3-second flight across 3,400 meters of air. At 0400 she got up, showered, dressed in the civilian clothes that marked her as not military, not official, just some contractor here to demonstrate software that nobody cared about. She ate breakfast in the chow hall, alone at a table in the corner, forcing down eggs and toast her stomach didn't want. At 0600 Vic picked her up and they drove to the range. The sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Wind flags were already up, snapping in a steady breeze from the southwest. Weather report called for clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions. Perfect conditions to make the hardest shot of her life, in front of an audience that included the man who destroyed her career. By 0800 the bleachers were filling up. Brass and politicians and defense contractors, all dressed in their respective uniforms of power. Catherine watched them from her position by the firing line, these men and women who made decisions about war from conference rooms and never had to live with the blood under their fingernails. And then she saw him. Colonel James Dutton, 64 years old and wearing it well, his uniform pressed to razor edges, his silver eagles catching the sun. He moved through the crowd shaking hands, smiling that political smile that made him look trustworthy and competent, and exactly like the kind of officer the Corps promoted to general. He hadn't seen her yet. She was just another contractor setting up equipment beneath his notice. She wanted him to watch, wanted to see his face when he realized what was happening, wanted him to understand, finally, what it meant to be on the wrong side of history. At 0900 Colonel Martinez stepped up to the microphone and welcomed everyone to the demonstration, talked about the future of long-range engagement, about new technologies and training methods, about maintaining America's edge in an uncertain world. The words washed over Katherine like background noise. All she heard was her own heartbeat, steady and slow, falling into the old rhythm. At 10:15, they called her to the line. The announcement was simple, clinical. Civilian ballistic consultant Katherine Brennan would be demonstrating advanced targeting software at extended range. Target distance, 3,400 meters. Current range record, 3,400 meters, set by Colonel James Dutton in 2015. She saw Dutton's head snap up in the VIP section, saw recognition flash across his face, followed by confusion, then something that might have been fear. Good. Katherine approached the firing line where the M110 waited, black and patient. Vic was already in position at the spotting scope, his face set in hard professional lines. Around them, the crowd had gone quiet, 300 people holding their breath. She picked up the rifle. The weight settled into her hands like coming home. Vic keyed his mic, voice steady and clear. Wind 7 knots southwest, temperature 86 degrees, barometric pressure 29.87 and falling, mirage moderate stable, range 3,400 meters, target ready. Katherine settled into position, cheek to stock, eye to scope. The world narrowed down to crosshairs and distance and all the mathematics of violence she'd spent 18 years trying to forget. Through the scope she could see the target, impossibly small, impossibly far. A steel plate 36 inches square, waiting 2.1 miles away for a bullet that would take 3 seconds to arrive. 3 seconds. Enough time for wind to shift, for temperature to change, for the Earth to rotate beneath the round's flight path. Enough time for everything to go wrong. Or just enough time for everything to go right. She took a breath, let it out, took another, found the space between heartbeats where the whole world went still. Her finger touched the trigger. Somewhere in the bleachers, James Dutton was watching. Somewhere in a hospital bed 60 miles east, Louis Chen was waiting. Somewhere in the mathematics of wind and distance and 18 years of bitter survival, an equation was finally ready to be solved. Katherine Brennan, 58 years old and done with running, done with hiding, done with letting other people write her story, squeezed the trigger and sent truth downrange at 2,800 feet per second. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The sound rolled across the desert like thunder. And 3,400 meters away, after 3 seconds that felt like forever, steel rang like a bell announcing that some ghosts, when they finally remember how to strike, hit exactly where they aim. 3 seconds is no time at all. The span of a heartbeat, the gap between thunder and lightning, the space it takes to draw breath and wonder if you've made a mistake that can't be unmade. 3 seconds is forever when a bullet's in flight and 300 people are holding their breath, and the entire trajectory of your life depends on 3,400 meters of air doing exactly what you calculated it would do. Katherine Brennan stayed behind the scope, her eye tracking the bullet's invisible path, her body still locked in that perfect shooting position that her muscles remembered even after 18 years of trying to forget. Beside her, Vic had the spotting scope trained downrange. His breathing stopped, his whole world narrowed to a steel plate 2 miles away, and the question of whether truth had enough velocity to close the distance. The sound came back first, a metallic ping that echoed across the desert valley, clear and pure and unmistakable, the sound of bullet meeting target, the sound of impossible becoming fact. Then the spotter's voice over the radio, shaking slightly, hit, center mass, confirmed center hit at 3,400 meters. The silence that followed was the kind that comes right before an earthquake, when the ground knows something's about to shift but the people standing on it haven't figured it out yet. Katherine stayed frozen, not quite believing, waiting for someone to call it wrong, to say the spotter had made a mistake, that heat waves had fooled them all. But Vic's hand landed on her shoulder, gripped tight and sure, and his voice in her ear was steady. "You did it, Kit. Perfect shot. Dead center." She lifted her head from the scope, blinked against the sudden brightness of unfiltered sun, turned to look at the bleachers where 300 people sat in stunned silence, their faces showing various degrees of shock and awe and the slow realization that they'd just witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be possible. In the front row of the VIP section, Colonel James Dutton sat with his face gone pale, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Katherine with an expression she couldn't quite read. Recognition, yes. Shock, certainly. But underneath it something else. Something that looked like fear. Colonel Martinez stepped up to the microphone, her voice carrying across the range with professional composure that didn't quite hide her amazement. "Ladies and gentlemen, that was a confirmed hit at the maximum range of this facility, matching the current record set by Colonel Dutton 9 years ago. An exceptional demonstration of both human skill and the advanced ballistic software being tested today." Matching, not breaking. Katherine felt something twist in her chest. She'd hit the target, proved she could still shoot, but she hadn't exceeded the distance. The record still stood, which meant Chen's strategy, the whole plan to prove she was better than the man who'd destroyed her, had just fallen short by exactly 0 meters. She started to stand, started to process what matching but not breaking meant for everything they'd planned, when Vic gripped her shoulder harder. "Wait," he said quietly, "listen." Martinez was still talking. "However, I've been informed that the software consultant would like to attempt an extended range demonstration. Per safety protocols and range limitations, we'll need to move this to range 500, which offers clear sight lines to 4,000 meters. 4,000 meters, 2.4 miles, 600 meters beyond Dutton's record, beyond what anyone at Twentynine Palms had ever attempted in an official capacity." Katherine looked at Vic. "What did you do?" "Called in a favor. Martinez owes me from Fallujah, back when she was a lieutenant, and I pulled her out of an ambush. Told her this morning we might want to showcase the software's full capability. 4,000 meters is insane. The variables compound geometrically at that distance. Wind, temperature, the fucking curvature of the Earth starts to matter." "I know, but matching Dutton's record doesn't prove anything except that you're as good as you used to be. Breaking it, exceeding it by a margin that can't be dismissed, that proves you're better. That proves the discharge was a lie." She wanted to argue, wanted to say that she'd already pushed her luck as far as it would stretch, that demanding more was asking for failure. But she looked across at Dutton, saw him leaning toward an aide, saw his mouth moving in words she couldn't hear but could guess. He was already spinning this, already preparing to explain away her success as a fluke, as software doing the work, as anything but what it actually was. Proof that Katherine Brennan was still one of the finest snipers the military had ever produced. "How long do I have?" she asked. 30 minutes to reposition. Martinez is calling a break, let people stretch their legs. Range 500's 2 clicks west. We can drive the equipment over, get you set up." Katherine looked down at the M110, still warm from that perfect shot. Looked at her hands, steady now that the moment had passed. Looked at the desert stretching out in all directions, patient and indifferent and ready to swallow whatever hubris she was about to display. "Okay," she said, "let's break his fucking record." The move to range 500 took 20 minutes of controlled chaos. Vic drove while Katherine sat in the passenger seat, running calculations in a notebook that looked like something from a physics textbook. 4,000 meters meant the bullet would be in flight for almost 4 seconds. meant wind would have that much longer to push it off course, meant every tiny error in her shooting position would be magnified into feet of deviation downrange. The math was brutal, unforgiving, exactly the kind of challenge that made most snipers tap out and admit that some distances were better left to artillery. But Katherine had never been most snipers. Range 500 was older than Range 400, built back when the Corps still believed that perfect marksmanship could win wars before they learned that wars were won by logistics and air superiority and political will. The range stretched into a valley between two ridgelines, the target berms visible as dark lines against the desert floor. At 4,000 meters, the final target was barely visible even with naked eye, a speck that wavered in and out of existence depending on how the air moved. The crowd had followed, somehow grown larger. Word had spread across the base that something unusual was happening, that some civilian consultant was about to attempt a shot that existed more in theory than practice. Young Marines lined the fences, eager to see someone try the impossible. Old Salt stood in the back, arms crossed, faces skeptical, waiting to see another hotshot learn about humility the hard way. And in the VIP section, now relocated to a hastily assembled seating area, Colonel James Dutton sat with his jaw clenched and his eyes hard, watching Katherine set up with the intensity of a man watching his past come back to kill him. She ignored him, ignored all of them. The audience didn't matter. The stakes didn't matter. All that mattered was the rifle, the target, and the 4,000 meters of air between them that she had to read like a book written in invisible ink. Vic set up the spotting scope, pulled out a weather station that looked like it belonged in a meteorology lab. Winds picked up, 8 to 10 knots variable direction, temperatures climbing 92 and rising, humidities dropping, barometric pressure still falling. He looked at her, concern clear in his eyes. These aren't ideal conditions, Kit. The wind alone could push the round off by 2-3 feet at this range. Then I'll account for it. It's not just accounting, it's predicting. At 4,000 meters, you're reading what the air's going to do 4 seconds from now across 2.5 miles of desert. That's not precision, that's prophecy. You got a better idea. He didn't. Neither did she. They had 30 minutes and one chance to do something that would either cement her legacy or confirm that some distances were meant to stay unreachable. She ran through her pre-shot ritual, the same sequence she'd performed 1,000 times in a war that felt like it had happened to someone else. Check the rifle, confirm zero, test the trigger pull, settle into position, find the breathing rhythm that made everything else disappear. Through the scope, the target was a shimmer, a suggestion, more heat distortion than metal. She watched how the air danced across the landscape, studied the wind flags along the range telling their contradictory stories. Read the desert the way sailors read the sea, looking for patterns in chaos. Colonel Martinez's voice came over the loudspeaker. Range is hot. Spotter, confirm target distance. Vic keyed his radio. Target confirmed at 4,000 meters. Wind conditions variable. Shooter is ready. Katherine wasn't ready. Nobody could be ready for this, but she was as close as she was going to get. She made the calculations one more time. Elevation, 31.5 mils. Windage, 2.7 mils left to account for the crosswind, plus 0.3 mils right for the Coriolis effect at this latitude. Temperature correction, humidity correction, barometric pressure correction. A dozen variables feeding into a mathematical equation that had to be perfect because there was no margin for error at this distance. She dialed it into the scope, settled her crosshairs on a point 18 feet left and 9 feet high of where the target actually was, trusting physics and experience and 18 years of rust to somehow remember what perfection felt like. Her finger found the trigger. In the bleachers, someone coughed. The sound carried in the stillness, harsh and intrusive. She ignored it, ignored everything except the scope and the target and the space between heartbeats where doubt couldn't reach. She fired. The rifle's recoil was familiar, almost comforting. The sound of the shot rolled across the valley and echoed off the ridgelines, coming back as a ghost of itself. Through the scope she watched the bullet's invisible path, tracking by instinct rather than sight, following mathematics she couldn't see but knew were there. 1 second. The bullet clearing the first 1,000 meters, still supersonic, still stable. 2 seconds. Wind pushing from the left, gravity pulling down, the earth rotating beneath the round's flight. 3 seconds. The bullet starting to lose velocity, starting to drop faster, becoming more vulnerable to every variable she'd tried to account for. 4 seconds felt like dying. Felt like every mistake she'd ever made compressed into a single moment where the universe decided whether to show mercy or exact payment for hubris. The sound came back different this time. Not a clean ping, but something softer, duller. The sound of a bullet hitting dirt instead of steel. "Miss," Vic called, his voice carefully neutral. "Impact low right, approximately 2 meters. The crowd released its held breath in a collective sigh that sounded like disappointment or relief, depending on who was doing the sighing. Katherine stayed in position, already making corrections in her head. 2 meters low right meant she'd underestimated the wind shift, overcompensated for the drop. The adjustments would be small, fractional, but at 4,000 meters small errors became measured in yards. She dialed the scope, raised the elevation 1/2 mil, shifted windage left another 1/4 mil, but something nagged at her, something in the way the flags were moving, the way the heat shimmer was flowing across the valley floor. She lifted her eye from the scope and just watched. Watched the wind flags nearest the target, watched the mirage boil and settle in patterns that told a story about what the air was doing down there, 2.5 miles away from where she sat. "Kit," Vic said quietly, "you good?" "Wait," she kept watching. The flags were telling her one thing, the mirage another. The wind at her position was steady 8 knots from the southwest, but downrange, where the bullet would arrive 4 seconds from now, something was shifting. She could see it in the way dust devils formed and dissipated, in the way heat waves bent and straightened. "Wind's about to drop," she said. "I'm reading 8 to 10 knots. Here, not there," she pointed downrange. "Watch the flags at 2,500 meters. Watch how they're starting to go limp." Vic swung his spotting scope to the mid-range flags. Long pause. "You're right, they're settling, dropping to maybe 5-6 knots. By the time my round gets there, it'll be even less. The afternoon thermal is breaking. Air's starting to settle for evening." She looked at the western sky, at the sun beginning its long fall. "I've got maybe 2 minutes before it changes again." She settled back behind the scope, but this time she made different calculations. Not for the wind that was, but for the wind that would be when the bullet arrived. Reduced her windage compensation by a full mil, trusted that the desert would cooperate, that her read of the air was right. Vic's voice was quiet. "You sure about this?" "No, but I'm sure the math I used last time was wrong." She controlled her breathing, found the rhythm, let the world go still. Second shot. Same ritual. Same perfect stillness that made her forget she was 58 years old with metal in her shoulder and tremors in her hands when the temperature dropped. The rifle spoke again. 4 seconds of flight. 4 seconds of prayer disguised as ballistics. 4 seconds of every person on that range holding their breath and wondering if they were watching history or just watching someone fail spectacularly in public. But Katherine Brennan wasn't watching the shot. She was reading the wind, watching the flags downrange, seeing them go still just as she'd predicted, watching the mirage settle into that perfect clarity that only comes when the desert air decides to cooperate for a handful of seconds. The sound that came back was sharper this time, higher pitched, the distinct ring of copper-jacketed lead meeting hardened steel. "Stand by," Vic called, his eye glued to the spotting scope. Long pause. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. Then, "Kit, you called that wind shift perfect. That wasn't luck." Another pause longer. "Hit. Confirm hit. Edge of target, lower left quadrant." Hit, not center mass. Not perfect. But contact at 4,000 meters, which made it official, which made it count. Which meant she'd just broken James Dutton's record by 600 meters. The crowd erupted. Not polite applause, but genuine amazement, the kind of reaction that comes when people witness something they'll tell stories about for years. Young Marines were shouting. Old salts were nodding with grudging respect. Even the VIP section was standing, though Dutton remained seated, his face a carefully controlled mask that didn't quite hide the rage underneath. Katherine stayed behind the scope, not quite believing it. The hit had been marginal, more skill than luck, but luck had played its part. Reading the wind shift had been instinct, the kind of feel for the desert that came from years of living in it, breathing it, learning its moods. But in the mathematics of records, margin didn't matter. Contact was contact. 4,000 meters was 4,000 meters. She'd done what Chen needed her to do, what Vic had believed she still could do, what 18 years of exile said should have been impossible. She'd proven that Katherine Brennan wasn't broken, just angry. Colonel Martinez was back at the microphone, her voice carrying official congratulation that had genuine amazement underneath. "Ladies and gentlemen, that was a confirmed hit at 4,000 meters, exceeding the previous facility record by 600 meters. An extraordinary demonstration of both human capability and advanced targeting systems." Vic pulled her up from the shooting position, wrapped her in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground despite his 62 years. "You did it," he said into her ear. "You beautiful stubborn ghost, you actually did it." She hugged him back, feeling 18 years of distance collapse into this moment of shared victory. Thunder and lightning, making noise one more time. When Vic set her down, she looked across at the VIP section. At James Dutton, still seated, still frozen, staring at her with eyes that held the dawning realization that the past he thought he'd buried had just risen up and broken his record in front of witnesses he couldn't intimidate into silence. She met his gaze, didn't smile, didn't gloat, just looked at him with the steady patience of someone who'd waited 18 years for this moment and could wait a few minutes more for what came next. Because the shot was just the beginning. Chen had said it himself. Breaking the record changed the narrative, made her credible, turned her from bitter has-been into competent warrior demanding justice. Now came the hard part. Now came the testimony and the evidence and the fight against a system designed to protect its own. But first, she had something to do. She walked across the range, past the fence line, past the crowd still buzzing with excitement, straight toward the VIP section where Dutton sat surrounded by brass and politicians who were already starting to sense that something larger was happening, something beyond an impressive shooting demonstration. Security started to move, started to intercept, but Colonel Martinez waved them off. Apparently favors from Fallujah went deeper than Katherine had realized. She stopped 3 feet from Dutton, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his jaw, close enough to smell the cologne that probably cost more than her monthly rent, close enough to make him uncomfortable without saying a word. "Colonel," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden silence, "congratulations on holding that record for 9 years. That's a hell of a run." Dutton stood slowly, every inch the dignified officer. "Ms. Brennan, impressive shooting today. Your software appears to be quite effective." "It's not the software." "No. No, it's the shooter. Same shooter who refused an illegal order in Afghanistan 18 years ago. Same shooter you court-martialed for cowardice to cover up a war crime. Same shooter you thought you'd buried so deep she'd never surface." The VIP section went dead quiet. Several congressmen looked confused. The other officers looked uncomfortable, starting to understand they'd walked into something that had nothing to do with demonstrations or technology. Dutton's face remained calm, but his eyes were ice. "I don't know what you're talking about. You were discharged for failing to perform under combat conditions. The record speaks for itself." "Does it? Because I have a different record. One that includes drone footage of the compound you ordered me to fire on. The one with 14 civilians, 6 of them children. The one you needed to justify a NATO airstrike that went wrong." "You're delusional, and this is neither the time nor place for airing personal grievances." "You're right. The time was 18 years ago in a court-martial where you lied under oath. The place was Afghanistan, where you ordered me to murder children. But since we missed those opportunities, here and now we'll have to do." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a thumb drive, held it up for everyone to see. "This contains evidence that Colonel Dutton ordered a sniper to engage a civilian target to create justification for a military strike that killed 14 innocent people. It contains testimony from the spotter who was present. It contains my original logbook with entries that prove I reported civilians and was ordered to fire anyway." She tossed the thumb drive to Colonel Martinez, who caught it reflexively. "I'm formally requesting a court-martial review of my discharge, and I'm formally accusing Colonel Dutton of ordering an unlawful attack on a civilian population under the laws of armed conflict." Dutton's composure cracked. His face flushed red, his voice rising. "This is absurd. I will not stand here and be accused by a washout who couldn't handle the pressure of combat." "Then sit down," Katherine said quietly, "because you're about to have a lot of pressure of your own to handle." She turned to Martinez. "That thumb drive contains contact information for Louis Chen, retired gunnery sergeant, currently at the VA hospital in Barstow. Stage 4 cancer, maybe 2 months to live. He's ready to testify. He kept everything, Colonel. Every piece of evidence Dutton thought was destroyed. He's been sitting on it for 18 years, waiting for the right time." Martinez looked down at the thumb drive in her hand like it was a live grenade. She was a full colonel, career officer, someone who'd climbed the ranks by being smart and careful, and knowing when to stay out of political fights. But she was also a Marine, and Marines had codes that went deeper than politics. "This is a serious accusation," Martinez said carefully. "It requires proper channels, proper investigation." "I know. That's why I'm making it here in public in front of witnesses who aren't part of the chain of command that protected Dutton for the last 18 years. Katherine looked around at the crowd, at the young Marines watching with wide eyes, at the old salts who'd seen enough to know truth when they heard it. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for what I should have gotten 2 decades ago. A fair hearing. A look at the evidence. Justice for the civilians who died, and the soldier who got punished for trying to save them." One of the congressmen stood up, a man in his 70s with white hair and a flag pin on his lapel. "Colonel Martinez, if there's evidence of wrongdoing, it needs to be investigated. The American people demand accountability from their military." Another voice, this one from a young lieutenant standing near the fence. "Ma'am, I saw the shot. At 4,000 meters. That's not someone who couldn't handle combat pressure. That's exceptional performance." More voices joining in. Marines who'd watched her shoot. Officers who'd seen Dutton's reaction, even some of the contractors, recognizing good television when they saw it, pulling out phones to record. Dutton stood there, surrounded by the slowly collapsing remains of the narrative he'd built. His face had gone from red to pale, his hands clenched at his sides. This is a witch hunt, a bitter former subordinate with an axe to grind. Then let's sharpen it in court, Katherine said. Let's put the evidence in front of a panel. Let's see if a bitter former subordinate with an axe to grind can prove that a full colonel lied under oath and ordered a war crime. I'm willing to risk being wrong. Are you willing to risk being proven guilty? The silence that followed was the kind that comes before verdicts, before sentences, before the hammer falls and changes everything. Colonel Martinez looked at the thumb drive, looked at Katherine, looked at Dutton, made the calculation that every officer makes when duty and politics collide and there's no safe answer. Colonel Dutton, she said formally, I'm going to recommend to the commanding general that this matter be investigated by NCIS pending a possible Article 32 hearing. You're free to leave, but I'd recommend you retain counsel. Dutton's jaw worked. His eyes swept across the crowd, looking for support, finding none. Even his fellow officers had stepped back, creating physical distance from a man who might be toxic. He looked at Katherine one more time. She held his gaze, steady and patient, a woman who'd waited 18 years and could wait as long as it took. This isn't over, Dutton said quietly. No, Katherine agreed, it's just beginning. He turned and walked away, his back straight, his pace measured, every inch the professional officer. But everyone watching knew what they'd just seen. The beginning of an end. The first crack in a wall built on lies. Katherine stood in the desert sun, surrounded by Marines and politicians, and the ghost of who she used to be, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 18 years. Not victory. Not yet. There would be investigations and hearings and lawyers who try to bury the truth under procedure and precedent. But for the first time since that day in Afghanistan when she'd said no and paid for it with everything, Katherine Brennan felt like the story might have a different ending than the one she'd been living. She walked back to where Vic stood by the rifle, his face showing pride and worry in equal measure. Now what? He asked. Now we wait, and we fight, and we make sure Louis knows his last act mattered. You think they'll actually court-martial Dutton? I think they won't have a choice, not with this many witnesses, not with evidence they can't pretend doesn't exist. She looked at the rifle, still warm from the shots that had changed everything. And if they try to bury it anyway, we'll make enough noise that the whole world hears. Thunder and lightning, she thought, one last storm. And this time, when the thunder warned and the lightning struck, everyone was going to see exactly what they'd been missing for 18 years. The truth, sharp and bright and impossible to ignore. 6 weeks later, Katherine Brennan sat in a conference room at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, watching 3 full colonels and a brigadier general review evidence that had been buried for 18 years. The room smelled like coffee gone cold, and the particular tension that comes when the institution has to decide whether protecting its image matters more than protecting its integrity. She'd spent those 6 weeks in a kind of limbo, caught between civilian life and military investigation, neither fully one thing nor the other. The garage in Nevada sat locked and empty, her life reduced to a hotel room near the base and daily meetings with JAG officers who asked the same questions in 17 different ways, looking for inconsistencies that would let them dismiss the whole thing as a vindictive fantasy. They hadn't found any, because it wasn't fantasy. It was truth, documented and preserved by a dying man who decided that clearing his conscience mattered more than protecting his pension. Louis Chen had testified 3 weeks ago, brought into the proceedings on a hospital gurney because he was too weak to sit in a chair. Katherine had watched him through a video feed, seen how cancer had winnowed him down to almost nothing, watched him raise his right hand and swear to tell the truth with a voice that barely carried across the room. But what he'd lacked in volume, he'd made up for in precision. Every date correct, every detail clear, every piece of evidence cataloged with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd spent his career making sure the right information got to the right people at the right time. He died 4 days later, peacefully according to the VA hospital, surrounded by family who finally understood why their husband and father had seemed so focused those last months. Jenny had called Katherine afterward, her voice thick with tears and something that might have been gratitude. "He needed this," Jenny had said. "Needed to know he'd done one brave thing before he went. Thank you for giving him that chance." Katherine hadn't known what to say to that. Hadn't known how to explain that Chen had given her something too, a chance to prove that standing up mattered even when it cost everything. So she just said she was sorry for Jenny's loss and meant it, because losing Louis Chen, even with his redemption arc complete, still felt like losing something the world needed more of. Now she sat watching the panel deliberate behind closed doors, their muffled voices carrying through walls that were supposed to be soundproof but weren't quite. Vic sat beside her, still in uniform because he hadn't retired yet, had delayed his separation papers until this was finished. He'd testified too, confirmed everything Chen had said, admitted his own silence with a frankness that had impressed the panel even as it condemned him. They'd recommended he be reprimanded for failure to report. He'd accepted it without argument, said it was less than he deserved. The door opened. A captain who looked too young to be anyone's lawyer gestured them inside. Katherine stood, smoothed her civilian slacks, walked into the conference room where 4 senior officers sat behind a table loaded with folders and tablets and the accumulated weight of evidence that couldn't be ignored. The brigadier general, a woman named Sarah Castellano with silver hair and eyes that had seen their share of wars, looked at Katherine with an expression that might have been respect or might have been exhaustion. Probably both. "Ms. Brennan," she said, "please sit." Katherine sat. Vic took the chair beside her, his back straight, his hands folded, every inch the professional soldier even now. General Castellano folded her hands on top of the nearest folder. "We've reviewed all the evidence submitted by Gunnery Sergeant Chen, confirmed the authenticity of the drone footage, and conducted our own analysis of the audio recordings from the operation in question. We've also reviewed your service record, your court-martial transcript, and the testimony provided by Sergeant Major Hayes." Katherine waited. The general's voice had that careful neutrality that meant bad news was coming wrapped in procedure. "The evidence is compelling," Castellano continued. "It supports your account of events in 2006. The drone footage clearly shows a civilian compound. The audio clearly contains an order to engage despite your report of noncombatants. The subsequent NATO airstrike resulted in 14 civilian casualties, which was documented at the time but attributed to faulty intelligence rather than deliberate action." "So you believe me," Katherine said. "We believe the evidence, which brings us to the complicated part." Castellano glanced at her fellow panel members. "Colonel Dutton has retained counsel and is contesting the findings. His lawyers argue that the passage of time makes reliable prosecution impossible, that key witnesses are dead, that operational context from 18 years ago cannot be accurately reconstructed." "Chen wasn't dead when he testified." "No, but he is now, which means he can't be cross-examined, which means his testimony, however compelling, has limitations in a formal court-martial proceeding." Katherine felt something cold settle in her chest. You're saying Dutton walks. I'm saying that the legal standard for a court-martial is high, and Dutton's lawyers are very good at exploiting technicalities. They're arguing that even if the order was given, battlefield conditions and operational pressures create gray areas in command decision-making. They're claiming the targeting decision was made in good faith based on available intelligence, and that your refusal to fire represented a failure to trust your chain of command. That's bullshit, and everyone in this room knows it. What we know and what we can prove in a proceeding that Dutton's lawyers will fight at every stage are two different things. Castellano's voice softened slightly. Ms. Brennan, I want you to understand something. We believe you. The panel believes you. The evidence supports everything you've claimed, but the institution has to weigh other factors. The political implications of court-martialing a colonel on the verge of promotion. The precedent it sets for second-guessing battlefield decisions. The potential damage to military morale and public confidence. So the institution protects itself, like it always does. The institution tries to balance justice with operational reality. It's not perfect. It's often not even fair, but it's the system we have. Vic spoke up, his voice hard. General, with respect, what you're describing isn't balance. It's cowardice. You have evidence of an illegal order, evidence of a cover-up, evidence that an officer lied under oath to destroy a soldier's career. If that's not enough to warrant a court-martial, then the system isn't flawed. It's broken. One of the colonels bristled. Sergeant Major, you're out of line. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, I'm the only one in line. The line that says we hold ourselves to a higher standard. The line that says we don't let politics protect officers who violate the laws of war. Castellano held up a hand. Sergeant Major Hayes, I understand your frustration, but throwing accusations doesn't change the legal reality we're facing. Katherine leaned forward. Then what does change it? What would it take for you to actually hold Dutton accountable instead of finding reasons why it's too hard or too complicated or too politically inconvenient? The general met her eyes, held the gaze for a long moment, then reached for a different folder, this one thinner, marked with classification stamps. There may be another option, Castellano said, one that achieves accountability without the complications of a court-martial. I'm listening. Colonel Dutton's promotion to brigadier general requires Senate confirmation. That confirmation process includes review of the officer's complete record, including any ongoing investigations or credible allegations of misconduct. If this panel issues a formal finding that your discharge was improper and recommends reinstatement with back pay and restoration of rank, it creates a public record that the Senate will have to consider. You think they'll deny his promotion? I think they'll ask questions he won't want to answer. I think the publicity around your case, combined with Chen's testimony and the evidence we've reviewed, creates enough doubt that his confirmation becomes politically toxic. No senator wants to be the one who promoted an officer accused of ordering attacks on civilians, even if the accusation can't be proven in court. Katherine sat back, processing. It wasn't justice. Not really. Dutton wouldn't see the inside of a stockade, wouldn't face a panel of his peers, wouldn't pay the price that military law demanded for what he'd done. But he'd lose the star he'd spent 40 years climbing toward. He'd retire under a cloud of suspicion. He'd spend whatever years he had left knowing that everyone who looked at his record would see the asterisk, the question mark, the unproven but credible allegation that he'd ordered a war crime and destroyed a soldier to cover it up. What about my discharge? She asked. Overturned. Dishonorable change to honorable. Full restoration of rank and benefits. Back pay calculated from date of discharge to present. We can't give you the 18 years back, Ms. Brennan, but we can acknowledge they were taken wrongly. And my record, the citation for cowardice, expunged, replaced with a commendation for moral courage in refusing an unlawful order. It's not the Medal of Honor, but it's official recognition that you were right. Vic's hand found hers under the table, squeezed once. She squeezed back, feeling the weight of 18 years starting to lift just slightly. "I want one more thing," Katherine said. "Name it." "I want Chen's name on that commendation. I want the record to show that Gunnery Sergeant Louis Chen preserved evidence of wrongdoing at personal risk, and that his testimony was instrumental in correcting a miscarriage of justice. I want his family to know he died a hero, not someone who stayed silent." Castellano nodded slowly. "I think we can make that happen." "And Hayes," he testified, "he's accepting a reprimand. I want his record to reflect that he ultimately chose truth over self-preservation." Already noted in his file. The reprimand will be minor, and his service record will include a statement acknowledging his cooperation with this investigation. Katherine looked at Vic, then back at the general. "How long until the decision is public?" 2 weeks. We'll issue findings, send notification to Dutton's counsel, forward the recommendation to the Senate Armed Services Committee. After that, it's out of our hands." "But you think it'll work? You think he'll lose the star?" Castellano's face was carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "I think the Senate takes civilian casualties very seriously, especially in an election year. I think your 4,000-meter shot got enough attention that people will be watching what happens next. And I think Colonel Dutton is about to learn that some records, once broken, stay broken." The meeting ended with handshakes and official language about forthcoming documentation. Katherine walked out of Camp Pendleton into California sunshine that felt warmer than it should have, brighter, like someone had adjusted the color saturation on the whole world. Vic walked beside her in silence until they reached his truck. Then he stopped, turned to face her, and for the first time in 6 weeks, he smiled. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it. We did it. You, me, Chen. Thunder and lightning and the last act of a dying man. What will you do now? Go back to Nevada, reopen the garage?" Katherine looked out at the Pacific visible in the distance, blue and vast and indifferent to human drama. Thought about the garage sitting empty. Thought about oil changes and transmission rebuilds and a life built on trying to forget. "No," she said, "I think I'm done running." "Then what?" "I think I'm going to teach." Vic raised an eyebrow. "Teach what?" "The thing nobody taught us. How to say no when you're ordered to do something wrong. How to stand up when the whole system's designed to make you sit down. How to be a warrior with a conscience instead of just another trigger puller following orders." "The Corps isn't going to like that." "The Corps needs it whether they like it or not. All those young Marines who watched me make that shot, who saw Dutton get called out, who witnessed what happens when someone finally fights back, they're going to have their own moments, their own impossible choices. Maybe if someone teaches them it's okay to choose right over easy, some of them will have the courage I barely had." Vic nodded slowly. Chen would have liked that, would have said it's exactly the kind of legacy worth leaving. "What about you? Still retiring in 4 months?" 2 months now. Delayed it for the investigation, but yeah, I'm done. 42 years is enough. Time to see if I remember how to be a civilian." "You'll hate it." "Probably, but I'll hate it with a clear conscience, which is an improvement over hating it while knowing I'm a coward." They stood in the parking lot, 2 old soldiers who'd found their way back to each other through bullets and evidence, and the stubborn refusal to let the past stay buried. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded Katherine of Afghanistan, of ranges and ridgelines, and a war that had asked too much and given too little. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to find me, for standing with me this time. Thank you for letting me, for not telling me to go to hell when I showed up at your garage. I thought about it. I know, the wrench in your hand looked ready to fly." She smiled, surprising herself. "Maybe next time." Deal. 2 weeks later, the findings were released. Catherine's discharge was officially overturned, her rank restored, her record cleared. The Commendation for Moral Courage was issued jointly in her name and Louis Chen's, a rare honor that acknowledged sometimes the bravest thing a soldier could do was refuse to fire. The news coverage was immediate and intense. Video of her 4,000-meter shot had gone viral, 40 million views and climbing. Her story became shorthand for everything people wanted to believe about the military: that good people could fight bad orders, that the truth eventually mattered, that justice delayed was still justice. Colonel James Dutton's promotion hearing was postponed pending Senate review, then postponed again, then quietly withdrawn, with Dutton announcing his retirement effective immediately. The official statement cited personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. The unofficial whispers told a different story. He'd been given a choice: retire now with what dignity remained, or face public hearings that would destroy whatever reputation he had left. The videos from Range 500 had been shared by every major news outlet. Journalists had tracked down the families of the civilians killed in that compound in 2006. Senators facing re-election had started asking uncomfortable questions about accountability and command responsibility. Dutton chose retirement. His wife filed for divorce 3 weeks later, the papers citing irreconcilable differences, but the timing telling its own story about what happens when 30 years of marriage collide with public disgrace. His son, a Marine captain with his own promising career, requested a transfer to Okinawa and stopped using his father's name in official correspondence. The house in Arlington sold for half what it was worth. The speaking engagements and board positions that usually followed general officer retirement never materialized. The military community, which had lionized him for decades, suddenly remembered other commitments when his name came up. It wasn't the courtroom justice Katherine had wanted, but it was something. A reckoning measured not in years behind bars but in isolation, in the slow erosion of everything a man had built his identity around. Dutton would spend whatever years he had left watching other colonels pin on stars while he sat alone in a smaller house with a phone that didn't ring. Katherine stood at Arlington National Cemetery on a cold October morning, watching Marines in dress blues lower Louis Chen into the ground with the honors due a gunnery sergeant who'd served honorably for 24 years. Jenny stood at the graveside with her children, all adults now, all there to witness their father's final recognition as someone who'd done the right thing when it counted most. After the service, after the flag had been folded and presented and the crowd had dispersed, Katherine stood alone at the grave with Vic beside her. She set down something she'd been carrying, a single brass casing from the 4,000-meter shot, engraved with the date and distance and a simple inscription: "For the last spotter who never stopped watching." "He earned this," she said quietly, "more than I did." "You both earned it," Vic replied. "Different ways, different times, but you both paid the price for doing what was right." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They stood in silence while the wind moved through the trees and the autumn sun painted long shadows across rows of white headstones that stretched toward the horizon. 6 months after that, Katherine Brennan stood in front of 200 Marine recruits at the School of Infantry, wearing the Master Sergeant insignia she'd been stripped of 18 years ago. Her hair was grayer, her shoulders still ached on cold mornings, but her voice was steady as she talked about the shot you don't take. About the moment when orders and conscience collide. About the courage it takes to say no when everyone around you is saying yes. The recruits listened with the intensity of young people who haven't yet learned that sometimes the hardest enemy is the one giving orders. But they'd learn. And when they did, when they faced their own impossible choices, maybe they'd remember the story of a master sergeant who lost everything for refusing to kill children. Maybe some of them would have the courage to do the same. After the lecture, a young Marine approached her, nervous and earnest. "Ma'am, I saw the video, the 4,000-meter shot. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen." Katherine shook her head. "That wasn't the shot that mattered, son. The shot that mattered was the one I didn't take 18 years ago. That's the one that defined everything after. Remember that. The hardest trigger to pull is the one you don't." The recruit nodded, not quite understanding yet, but he would. They all would eventually. That evening, Katherine drove to Range 400 at Twentynine Palms. The base let her come and go now, her clearance restored along with everything else. She parked at the range and walked out to the firing line where she'd made the shot that changed everything. The target at 4,000 meters was still there, the steel plate bearing the dent from her bullet. They'd left it as a marker, unofficial and unsanctioned but respected by everyone who used the range. A reminder that some distances weren't impossible, just improbable, and that sometimes improbable was enough. She didn't have a rifle this time. Didn't need one. Just stood at the line and looked out across the desert at the target shimmering in the distance, and thought about all the shots she'd taken and all the ones she'd refused. Thought about Louis Chen, dying but determined, preserving truth when silence would have been easier. Thought about Vic Hayes, choosing redemption over retirement, standing up 18 years late but standing nonetheless. Thought about James Dutton, retired now and alone, his star denied and his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about what happened when ambition mattered more than honor. And she thought about herself, 59 years old and still standing, still fighting, still refusing to let the past dictate the future. The sun was setting, painting the desert in gold and amber, and Katherine Brennan stood on the firing line and whispered to the wind and the distance and the ghost of her spotter who'd never stopped watching. "We did it, Louis, thunder and lightning, one last storm." The wind carried the words away across 3,400 meters of air that had witnessed impossible shots and impossible choices. And somewhere in that distance, in the mathematics of wind and memory and 18 years finally settled, Katherine swore she heard an answer. Not in words, not in sound, just in the feeling that comes when a debt is paid and a promise is kept and the long battle finally, mercifully, comes to an end. She turned from the range and walked back to her truck as the stars began to appear, one by one, like target markers in the darkening sky. Tomorrow she'd teach another class. Next week she'd testify before Congress about military accountability. Next month she'd visit Jenny Chen and tell her stories about Louis that his family had never heard. But tonight, she just drove through the desert with the windows down and the radio playing and the weight of 18 years finally, blessedly, lifted from her shoulders. Some ghosts, when they finally get to rest, leave the world lighter than they found it. Thunder and lightning had made enough noise to echo for generations. And in the silence that followed the storm, Katherine Brennan had finally found the peace that comes from knowing you stood up when it mattered, paid the price without complaint, and left behind something worth more than medals or rank or recognition. You left behind proof that conscience still mattered, that truth still won, sometimes, that warriors could have honor even when the institution didn't. And that some shots, the ones you didn't take, defined you more than all the ones that found their mark. She drove into the desert night, free at last, and let the road take her wherever warriors went when the fighting was finally done. 18 years. That's how long Kit Brennan carried the weight of doing the right thing. She refused to murder children when ordered. They court-martialed her, called her a coward, threw her away. Louis Chen kept the evidence, dying of cancer with just enough time to help her fight back. That 4,000-meter shot, just the beginning. The real story is what happened when she confronted the colonel who destroyed her. If you're a veteran who knows what it's like when orders conflict with conscience, drop a comment. And if this story moved you, there's more coming. Hit subscribe so you don't miss them.